Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nizzahon, and each and every week I post an MTG Top 10 list. This week we're looking at the top 10 dragons in Magic's history. Dragons are a creature type that appear on virtually every plane that Magic has ever visited, and Wizards has stated that they serve as the iconic creature type for the color red. Sooner or later I'll get around to doing lists for the other 4 iconic creature types, which are Angels for white, Demons for black, Sphinxes for blue, and Hydras for green. Anyway, so far 163 dragons have been printed. This list will focus on the 10 that made the biggest impact on the competitive Magic scene. This is one of those lists where I delve back into Magic's archives and discuss the 10 cards, in this case dragons, that have put up the most Grand Prix and Pro Tour top 8s. For each of the cards, we will also discuss its history and what made it so good. Before we get started on the top 10, let's first discuss how exactly this list is scored. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour top 8s they have received. When a Pro Tour top 8 with a Pro Tour top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix top 8. The cards in this list are arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. Alongside each of the cards, you also see the breakdown of these points and some other relevant information about the card, such as what formats it has seen success in. In addition to the top 10 dragons that appear in this video, I also decided to include the scores of all other dragons who have managed to obtain at least 1 point in Magic's history in the video description below. This is a result of frequent viewer responses wanting to know where exactly certain cards placed on the list that didn't quite make it to the top 10. Let me know if you want me to continue this on future videos. Before we get started, I do want to make one honorable mention. Shivan Dragon. Shivan Dragon is an honorable mention not because it comes close to making the list, it doesn't, though it did have 2 Pro Tour top 8s, one in 1994 and one in 1995, but it deserves an honorable mention because of its historical significance in Magic. This dragon has existed since Magic has existed, being originally printed in Alpha, and it was considered by many at the time to be a contender for the best creature in all of Magic, with Serra Angel as its primary competition. A 6-mana 5/5 flyer with the additional fire-breathing ability was incredibly powerful in an era when non-creature spells were far more powerful than creatures. Shivan Dragon even holds up to some degree today, and any time it's been printed in a limited format, it's a first pickable bomb. Hasn't seen play since the mid-90s, but given the fact that it was Magic's first iconic dragon, it deserves to be mentioned on a list like this one. Now then, let's move on to the top 10. At number 10, with a score of 12, we have Rorix Bladewing. Rorix Bladewing is pretty simple, 6 mana for a 6/5 with flying and haste. Today, we actually aren't all that impressed by that, and the reason I say that is because if we take a look at a recent card, like Dragon Lord Kolaghan, who has the same stats and converted mana cost with a whole bunch of extra text tacked on, it never saw any play. But Rorix Bladewing is an old card, and while not quite as old as Shivan Dragon, it was a very strong card in its own time, being printed in Onslaught, and it represented an incredibly quick clock. Rorix was strong enough to find his way into the most dominant deck there was in Onslaught block, Goblins, despite not being a goblin and not having any synergies with them. It was a great 1 or 2 of for a deck that sometimes needed the additional reach. It also managed to get a Pro Tour top 8 in a pretty sweet Dragon Tribal deck at Pro Tour Venice in 2003. In total, Rorix saw 4 Pro Tour top 8s at that Pro Tour Venice, 3 in Goblin decks and 1 in the aforementioned Dragon deck. A pretty good showing for the Dragon, but Rorix wasn't a card that only shined in block. He found his way into other formats too, including one of the most powerful standard formats ever, one dominated by both Affinity and Goblins, and he managed to pick up a top 8 with a land destruction deck in this incredibly hostile environment. Finally, Rorix also picked up a Pro Tour top 8 in Extended in a Reanimator deck, where he served as one of the deck's primary reanimation targets. The deck was capable of cheating Rorix into play on turn 2, which represents a frighteningly fast clock. At number 9, we have Furnace Dragon. At first glance, Furnace Dragon seems like a pretty bad card. It has affinity for artifacts, meaning it costs 1 less for every artifact you have, and that's great. But the rest of the text seems to contradict the dragon's affinity for artifacts. It exiles all artifacts when it comes into play. In other words, you have to run a ton of artifacts to make the dragon easily playable, but he gobbles them all up when he comes into play. But it's worth noting that he also does this to your opponent's artifacts, and despite the seemingly contradictory things this card does, Furnace Dragon existed in a metagame where it did exactly what you wanted it to. Affinity, one of the strongest decks of all time, was the most widely played deck in Mirrored and Block Constructed, and this was a great sideboard card for the Mirror matchup, even if you were playing Affinity yourself. If you resolved one of these at the right time, your opponent was done. Not only their creatures were predominantly artifacts, but also their lands, so affinity matchups in that format ended up going to whoever could power out their sighted-in Furnace Dragon first, since after he nuked the board, he represented a very quick clock. Non-affinity decks in block also ran it in the sideboard, since most decks ran a decent number of artifacts anyway, and a resolved Furnace Dragon just meant that your opponent had no chance of winning if they were playing affinity. In Standard, Goblin decks usually found a way to run the card, usually by running Great Furnaces, the red artifact land, and Darksteel Citadel, alongside the powerful artifacts Chrome Mox and Skull Clamp. Furnace Dragon did everything on its resume in a single year, and never found itself back in competitive formats as better sideboard cards against affinity, and ones that didn't require you yourself to play artifacts in the first place would emerge later on. At number 8, with a score of 14, we have Furnace Dragon. Actually, it's tied with Furnace Dragon. This is Kaiga the Tidestar, but Furnace Dragon had the same score. The reason I put Kaiga up higher is Kaiga had more Pro Tour top 8s. And most of Furnace Dragon's top 8s were also out of the sideboard, kind of devaluing them a little bit. But even though dragons regularly serve as the iconic creature type for red, and the vast majority of dragons are red, not all dragons are red, and Kaiga the Tidestar is an example of that. Part of a cycle of legendary dragons and champions of Kamigawa, Kaiga the Tidestar is one of the best in the cycle. For 6 mana, you're getting a 5/5 flyer, and that's great, a good way to quickly kill your opponent in the sky. But it gets worse for your opponent. Eventually, they're going to have to kill Kaiga before he kills them, and when they do, you get to steal your opponent's best creature. A crushingly painful 2-for-1 for your opponent. Obviously, Kaiga saw a fair amount of play when he was around and managed to amass a pretty impressive 7 Pro Tour top 8s, 2 of which were at Worlds in 2005. As is often the case for the creatures considered to be among the best in a format, Kaiga saw play in a variety of places, although control decks were the most prevalent. Many of the decks that played Kaiga in block constructed also made sure to be able to reanimate creatures from the graveyard, something that is backbreaking after your opponent already had to suboptimally play a removal spell on Kaiga. Kaiga also saw play in Standard, being featured as a win condition in blue-black control and blue-red Tron decks, which could power him out on turn 3, and serving as an important sideboard card in Heartbeat of Spring decks, which was a combo deck, and if you were up against a control deck, you could bring in Kaiga as your win condition instead of trying to combo off. While Kaiga never transitioned to non-rotating formats, to this day Kaiga is pretty much a staple in blue commander decks because of his raw power level, and also sees a fair amount of play in Cube. At number 7, we have another non-red dragon, and a member of the same Kamigawa cycle of legendary dragons that Kaiga came from, Ryusei the Morning Star. Every dragon in this cycle is a 6-mana 5/5 flyer, and they all do something when they die. This means that all of them represent major threats that have to be dealt with, but once you deal with them, you have to pay a pretty high price. Ryusei made your opponent pay a pretty big one. He made it so, first of all, your opponent skipped their untap step, and on top of that, he also tapped down 5 permanents when he died. Probably an individual would have had to play a removal spell to kill Ryusei, and when they did, they would have been tapping mana. That mana is not going to untap, and neither are 5 other permanents that you were hoping would untap. What's more, and this is true for Kaiga too, the way the legendary rule worked at the time, if you played 2 of the same legendary creature, they both died. I remember losing games to opponents after they managed to essentially time walk me with double Ryusei. What's worse is that Ryusei was usually played alongside a card called Glare of Subdual in Standard, a card that usually could lock you out of games on its own since generally your opponent was generating tons of creature tokens to tap your guys down. Ryusei mostly saw play in Glare of Subdual decks called Ghazi Glare because of a card called V2 Ghazi the City Tree, which generated Sapperling tokens which could be used to tap down your opponent's creatures. But he also saw play in Reanimator decks who could find a way to reanimate Ryusei over and over again, a good way to just win a game. At number 6, we have Thunderbreak Regent. We spent numbers 7 through 10 in roughly the same time period in Magic, from about 2003 to 2006, but now we are jumping ahead to Magic's much more recent past, where we find Thunderbreak Regent, who with 17 points just barely edges out Ryusei. Thunderbreak is not only a dragon, but a dragon with a tribal ability. Anytime any dragon gets targeted, your opponent gets lava spiked. This made Thunderbreak Regent a great card in Standard because in most scenarios you were getting value out of him. You either have a 4/4 flyer that can quickly pressure your opponent, or your opponent has to spend mana on a removal spell that also ends up hurting them. This got to be especially problematic when there were multiple Thunderbreak Regents in play. Thunderbreak also benefited from existing in a Standard format that offered a lot of incentives to play dragons, The one of these that was probably the most frequently played alongside Thunderbreak was the powerful Draconic Roar, which allowed you to lightning strike both a creature and an opponent if you had a dragon in your hand or in play. The Regent saw play in a wide variety of decks, including mono-red aggro decks, where he was a great curve topper, but he probably saw the most play in decks that really took advantage of the dragon sub-themes, such as Gruul Dragons, Mardu Dragons, and Rakdos Dragons. He has never really broken out in the non-rotating formats, but it doesn't seem completely impossible that he picks up a modern top 8 someday. At number 5, we return to another non-red dragon, Salem Gar the Drifting Death. Salem Gar has the exact same score as Thunderbreak Regent. Both even have 2 Pro Tour top 8s and 13 Grand Prix top 8s, but I gave Salem Gar the edge because he has 2 Grand Prix wins and 0 Pro Tour wins, as opposed to Thunderbreak, who only has 1 Grand Prix win. Part of a cycle of 2-color legendary dragons and Khans of Tarkir, Salem Gar put up the best resume of this cycle. This Salem Gar is an ideal finisher for a control deck. It has evasion in the form of flying, meaning it can just kill your opponent on its own, and it has hexproof, making it very hard to kill. What's more is anytime any dragon attacks, Salem Gar gives the defending player's creatures -1/-1. Even just swinging with Salem Gar is often enough to make it so you either have other favorable attacks or even kill a few of your opponent's creatures, and if you get a second dragon in play, well, then your opponent was really in trouble. Salem Gar existed in a format that had incredibly easy mana thanks to fetch lands and lands with 2 land types, and as a result, lots of different color combinations ran them. All of them control decks. This included dragon-heavy decks like Grixis, Esper, and Abzan dragons, but also decks with less of a dragon focus, like Esper Control and Blue-Black Control. Salem Gar doesn't stand a huge chance of seeing play anywhere now that he's rotated out of Standard, but he does make an interesting dragon commander. At number 4, we had a card that I actually thought would be much higher on this list, Broodmate Dragon. My memory of Broodmate Dragon's performance was clearly inflated. Like many of the cards on this list, Broodmate Dragon was one of the best creatures in its standard format. Paying 6 mana for 8/8 worth of flying is great, especially when spread over 2 bodies, which meant spot removal didn't really get you out of trouble against this card. Broodmate Dragon was powerful enough that Gabriel Nassif, who put together a sweet 5-color control deck for the standard Pro Tour Kyoto in 2009, and he won the whole thing with it. And he's running 5 colors, meaning he can decide to run whatever win condition he wants in Standard, and he decided that Broodmate Dragon was the best win condition. In other words, one of the best players in the game elected to play Broodmate when he could have chosen literally any other finisher in Standard. Pretty good indicator of the card's power. No one else put up a big finish with a 5-color deck featuring Broodmate Dragon, but the highly successful Jund decks in the Standard at the time existed in large part because they wanted to cast this dragon. As has been the case for most of the dragons on this list, Broodmate Dragon has never seen play in non-rotating formats and probably never will. Okay, so at number 3 I cheated a little bit and decided to lump the 4 Elder Dragon legends from Fate Reforged together. Actually, it's Dragons of Tarkir, not Fate Reforged. Dragons of Tarkir together, then they would have all taken their own slot on this list. And this affords us a chance to discuss some more cards. I can just put them all together. And I felt the Dragon Lords taking up 4 of 10 slots would be a bit much. Had I put all of these cards on this list according to their score, Salem Gar would be the one who would actually be here at number 3, Ojutai would actually be at number 4, and Atarka at number 5, and Dromoka at number 9. Obviously, all 4 of these dragons are insanely pushed. We mentioned the unfortunate 5th member of the cycle, Dragon Lord Kolaghan, earlier. He doesn't even come close to making this list, but these 4 really are incredibly powerful cards, and all 4 of these saw a lot of play in Standard. As mentioned with Thunderbreak Regent and Salem Gar the Drifting Death, these dragon legends weren't just super pushed on their own. They existed in a Standard with tons of great cards that paid you off for playing dragons, such as fellow cards on this list, Thunderbreak Regent and Salem Gar the Drifting Death, as well as cards like Foul Tongue Invocation, the aforementioned Draconic Roar, and Salem Gar's Scorn. This gave you incentive to play several dragons alongside one another, and it was not impossible, as good as mana was, for a deck to actually run all 4 of these particular dragons together, which is a very scary thing. Dragon Lord Salem Gar finishes in first place in part because of his ability to steal Planeswalkers. Once Gideon Ally of Zendikar especially became a commonly played card along with Chandra Flamecaller, it was a frequent thing to do to play Dragon Lord Salem Gar. It increased how frequently it was played because he could steal one of these walkers and then use their ultimate, meaning you destroyed their walker and you probably gave yourself some benefit. Obviously, his ability to steal cards is also creatures is also important, but the Planeswalkers are what really made it get pushed over the edge. Ojutai was an incredible win condition in control decks since it kept your hand loaded while also filtering your draws. Additionally, it has hexproof while it's untapped, so it can survive and block for a long time if you need it to. Dragon Lord of Tarko was also a staple in the ramp decks of the time, as they could power him out quickly and win the game. You know, when he blows up their whole board a lot of the time, and then he's just swinging for 8 every turn. In fact, I think Tarko's a she, so she. Dramoka was the least played, but was nigh impossible to beat for aggro decks because of the lifelink that it came with it and the huge toughness. None of them ever caught on outside of Standard, though a modern blue-white control deck running Dragon Lord Ojutai did recently come in 10th place at a Grand Prix, a modern Grand Prix within the last year. So if any of them has any hope, it's probably Ojutai. Now let's move on to number 2. At number 2, we have Thunder Maw Hellkite, who is our first mono-red dragon since Thunderbreak Regent at number 6, and also our first dragon to see play in a non-rotating format since Rorix Bladewing at number 10. Thunder Maw gives you a quick clock thanks to its high power and toughness for mana cost, not to mention the flying that most dragons have, and then also the haste. But what really pushes him over the top is his his come into play ability. He damages all of your opponent's flyers, and then taps them down. This seems somewhat inconsequential, but Thunder Maw Hellkite existed in the same standard where Lingering Souls was one of the most powerful and commonly played cards, and the Hellkite dealt with those tokens brilliantly. The Hellkite saw play in a variety of places, including basically every broad archetype in Magic. In other words, aggro, mid-range, and control decks. In aggro decks, it served as an excellent curve topper who could push through late damage while getting the Lingering Souls tokens who were going to chump block your guys out of the way. In mid-range, it served much the same role, though it often served as a primary way of beating your opponent instead of sort of a curve topper that gets you there in the end. And in control, it served as a late-game win condition. When Lingering Souls found its way into Modern, Thunder Maw Hellkite followed it, showing up most frequently in Jund deck sideboards to combat the pesky spirit tokens. Lingering Souls has begun to linger with how frequently it's played in Modern, and if Lingering Souls isn't being heavily played, then neither is Thunder Maw, and as a result, he hasn't picked up another Modern top 8 since 2014, but rest assured, if Lingering Souls experiences a resurgence, you can bet Thunder Maw Hellkite will as well. So maybe this dragon can add to his resume in the future. Now, what do we have at number 1? At number 1, we have a card that many of you likely expected, another mono-red dragon, and another card that's seen play in more than just Standard. Generally, for a card to top a list, they need to perform well in more than just Standard, and that's obviously what both Thunder Maw Hellkite and Stormbreath Dragon have done. Obviously a very push card, Stormbreath comes into play smaller than Thunder Maw Hellkite, but it packs protection from white, making it a difficult card to deal with, since frequently the best removal spells in a format are white. This included in Standard, cards like Chain to the Rocks, and in Modern, Path to Exile. What's more is in the later part of the game, you can make Stormbreath Dragon monstrous, making him a 7/7 flyer. And if that's not enough, he also damages your opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. Part of the reason Stormbreath Dragons makes this list isn't only because he has seen some play in Modern, but also because he found success in Standard when Theros Block was the newest set, which is when he was printed, but he was also briefly in Standard at the same time that all the Dragon payoff cards from Tarkir Block, which we've mentioned, were also in Standard, giving him the extra push to finish at number 1 on this list because he went well alongside the Dragons from Tarkir Block. Basically, Stormbreath was able to thrive in Devotion decks, the dominant deck of Theros Standard, but also Dragon decks, one of the most powerful decks in Tarkir Block Standard. In Modern, Stormbreath Dragon has recently found a home in Scred Red, picking up its last top 8 in November of 2016, so not that long ago, and as a result is the only card on this list that I would consider active, as no other card on this list has picked up a top 8 in the last calendar year, so Stormbreath may continue to build on its resume. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button. If you have any questions, if there's any dragons you want to know more about, although you can now look in the description to see more about them, you can post those in the comments as well. Suggestions for other top 10s are always nice as well. And don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s and other Magic the Gathering content. Also, before I end this video, I want to remind you guys that this channel is in part sponsored by 5colorcombo.com, which is a great site for various Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, videos relating to Magic. And they also have a great store, and in that store you can use my code Nizzahon5 to get a 5% discount. So thanks for